You're about to be fired for being late again." They called him irresponsible in front of the entire executive floor. Said a maintenance worker who couldn't show up on time didn't deserve a badge in their building. He didn't argue, just tightened his grip on his daughter's lunchbox. Minutes later, that same building would depend entirely on him. Sometimes the overlooked hands hold the real power. Before I show you the exact moment when the CEO recognized the insignia etched into that battered metal lunchbox and realized who she was firing, by the way, where are you watching from? Tell me in the comments below. Beneath the polished floors and tailored suits, something far bigger than tardiness was unfolding. The words hung in the air long after she stopped speaking. Caleb Rowan didn't lower his eyes. He didn't raise his voice either. The maintenance badge clipped to his worn navy jacket caught the lobby lights as executives slowed their steps to watch. Marble floors reflected tailored suits and glossy heels. He stood between the private elevators and the reception desk, boots dusted with drywall powder, holding a dented metal lunchbox decorated with a faded aerospace insignia. Ilara Voss adjusted the cuff of her blazer like she'd just corrected a typo. "You've been late 3 times this month," she said, her tone cool enough to frost glass. "This isn't a daycare, it's headquarters." A ripple of restrained laughter traveled through a cluster of junior analysts nearby. He felt it, not the insult, but the weight of eyes. Investors were due in less than an hour. The building hummed with anticipation. Polished screens cycled company milestones. Assistants moved quickly, whispering updates into discreet headsets. Caleb's fingers tightened around the lunchbox handle. The metal was warm from his palm. "I understand," he said quietly. No excuses. No explanations about school drop-offs or traffic lights, or the way his daughter refused to let go of his sleeve that morning. He didn't mention the late-night plumbing repair he'd handled alone while half the building slept. He didn't point out that the air filtration system on the executive floor had failed last week, and he'd fixed it before anyone noticed. Graham Holt, the chief operations officer, shifted uncomfortably near the reception desk. He glanced at Ilara, then at Caleb, then back at the digital clock mounted above the elevators. "This is a pattern," Ilara continued. "We can't afford patterns like that." The word afford echoed oddly in the cavernous lobby. He could smell the citrus polish on the marble, could hear the faint hydraulic sigh of elevators cycling above. Every detail felt sharp, present, anchored. "I won't be late again," he said. "That won't be necessary if this continues," she replied. "Consider this your final warning." Final. The syllables landed heavier than she intended. For a moment, silence pressed down on the space. Executives avoided his gaze now, as if dignity were contagious. Someone cleared their throat. A phone vibrated against a glass desk. Caleb nodded once. Then he turned. The service elevator waited beyond a brushed steel door marked authorized personnel only. Its paint was chipped near the handle. The corridor beyond was dimmer, quieter, meant for labor, not leadership. As he walked, the laughter behind him dissolved into murmurs. His boots made dull, steady sounds against the polished floor. He didn't rush, didn't shrink. Inside the service elevator, fluorescent lights flickered faintly overhead. The door slid shut with a mechanical sigh, sealing off the lobby's perfume and prestige. Only then did his shoulders lower a fraction. He looked down at the lunchbox. Mila had insisted on packing it herself that morning. The latch stuck sometimes. He'd bent it back into shape with pliers months ago. The insignia, an eagle crest wrapped around orbital rings, was scratched but unmistakable. He traced it absently with his thumb. 7 floors above, investors would be stepping into climate-controlled conference rooms. 7 floors below, a maze of pipes, servers, and conduit carried the invisible lifelines of the building. That was his territory. Power never looked there. The elevator descended with a soft shudder. He listened to the cables hum, counted the seconds between floors. Old habits. Quiet calculations. When the doors opened onto the maintenance level, the air felt warmer, heavier. The scent of machine oil replaced citrus polish. Racks of tools lined the concrete walls. Exposed pipes traced the ceiling like metallic veins. A junior technician looked up from a control panel. "You okay?" He set the lunchbox on a steel workbench. "Yeah." The word carried more weight than sound. From above, a faint vibration rippled through the structure, subtle enough that only someone used to listening would notice. He paused, head tilting slightly. Probably nothing. He reached for a diagnostic tablet and logged into the building's system interface. Screens flickered to life, displaying energy loads, elevator cycles, climate metrics. Upstairs, applause suddenly echoed faintly through ventilation ducts, investors arriving early. Caleb exhaled slowly. Final warning. The phrase lingered, but it didn't define him. Not the way the insignia did, not the way his daughter's small hand had squeezed his before she ran into school that morning. He adjusted a pressure gauge and listened again. The building hummed, and somewhere deep inside its layered systems, something shifted almost imperceptibly. He noticed. The vibration came again, soft, irregular, like a skipped heartbeat buried in steel. Caleb's eyes narrowed at the diagnostic tablet. Energy loads flickered for half a second before stabilizing. A minor fluctuation, the kind most systems auto-corrected without human intervention. Still, his instincts didn't relax. Buildings spoke in patterns. This one had just stuttered. Probably just calibration drift, the junior technician muttered, returning to his console. "Maybe," Caleb replied. But maybe it wasn't comforting. He zoomed into the building's integrated grid, security access, elevator logic, climate zoning, server redundancy. The architecture was sophisticated, layered with proprietary safeguards. Expensive. Elegant. Fragile if misunderstood. Another tremor pulsed through the concrete beneath his boots. Upstairs, applause filtered faintly through ductwork, followed by the muffled cadence of Alara's voice addressing investors. Confidence. Controlled. She would be describing innovation, reliability, dominance in aerospace systems integration. He glanced at the lunchbox, resting on the steel bench beside him. The scratched eagle insignia caught the fluorescent light. Mila had looked up at him that morning with cereal milk on her upper lip. "You won't be late again, right?" "I'll try," he'd told her. Trying wasn't the same as promising. Promises could break. He adjusted a valve reading, then stood still, listening, not with his ears, but with that old trained awareness that once kept far more complicated systems from catastrophic failure. He'd learned long ago that disasters whispered before they screamed. The tablet chimed. A yellow alert blinked across the security subsystem access node latency spike. "Hey," he called to the technician. "Did someone run diagnostics on executive floor access? No, should be clean." Another alert flashed. Then another. Latency cascaded into elevator timing mismatches. The pattern spread like ink in water, slow but deliberate. His jaw tightened. "Pull up investor presentation load," he said. The technician hesitated. "That's restricted." "Do it." Keys clacked. A projection server spike appeared, bandwidth peaking as live feeds streamed across floors. For a fraction of a second, redundancy buffers dipped below safe thresholds. There it is. Upstairs, the applause stopped abruptly. Instead, a mechanical thud reverberated down the shaft. The junior tech froze. Was that? Lights flickered once overhead. Caleb moved before panic could form. He tapped into manual oversight, bypassing surface-level diagnostics. Layers unfolded beneath his fingers, revealing something deeper. A synchronization fault between backup generators and primary grid relays. That wasn't random. That was architectural. Call operations, he said evenly. Tell them they've got a cascading sink failure building. The technician swallowed. You sure? I'm sure. Moments later, the maintenance line rang. Graham's voice came through, tight but measured. What's happening down there? Latency's spreading across core systems, Caleb replied. If the load keeps climbing, you'll lock elevators and trip security failsafes. A pause. Our engineers say it's contained. They're looking at surface metrics. Another vibration shuddered through the structure, stronger now. Somewhere above, a faint metallic clang echoed. Then the building lights dipped, not fully dark, but enough to silence every conversation upstairs. Caleb could almost see it, investors glancing at each other, Elara holding composure by sheer force of will. Listen, he continued, voice calm. You need to reduce presentation load and cycle non-essential systems offline. Now. That would disrupt. It'll disrupt less than a full lockout. Static crackled on the line. The technician whispered, security nodes are desyncing. As if summoned by the words, a sharp alarm tone blared through the maintenance corridor. Not the deafening emergency siren, just the warning prelude. Upstairs, faint shouting began to filter down the vents. Caleb's pulse remained steady. He'd heard worse alarms in tighter spaces. Caleb, Graham said quietly through the receiver, dropping formal tone. If you're wrong, I'm not. Silence again. Then, stand by. The line clicked off. He exhaled slowly and reached for the lunchbox, shifting it further from the console to keep it safe from stray tools. The metal felt solid under his palm. In the lobby above, chaos was no longer muffled. Elevator systems locked with a grinding halt. Access doors refused biometric scans. Investors were trapped between floors or confined to conference rooms. The building had chosen its moment. And he understood why. High system load, redundant streams, external pressure on internal architecture. It wasn't sabotage, it was design arrogance, too many layers trusting each other without a true manual backbone. Poetic in a way. Upstairs, Elara's voice cut sharply through overlapping noise. Controlled but edged now. Another tremor shook the pipes overhead. The junior technician stared at him. What do we do? Caleb looked at the expanding fault map on the tablet. Lines turned amber, then red, one by one. We stop it at the root. A fresh alert exploded across the screen, primary relay override disabled. That shouldn't be possible. Unless the system was protecting itself from itself. He inhaled slowly. Then he said, almost to himself, they built it beautifully, but they built it wrong. The alarm tone shifted from warning to escalation. And somewhere above, the CEO who had just threatened his livelihood realized her building was no longer listening to her. The alarm tone sharpened into something colder, more insistent. On the maintenance screen, red indicators multiplied across the executive floors. Elevator shafts showed stalled cabins suspended between levels. Security doors defaulted to lockdown protocols, sealing glass corridors with quiet, final clicks. Caleb's fingers hovered over the tablet for half a second, calculating. Upstairs, Elara Voss stood in the center of her glass-walled conference suite, investors seated around a polished obsidian table. Moments ago, she had been outlining expansion into adaptive aerospace infrastructure. Now the lights above them flickered like uncertain stars. What's happening? One investor demanded. It's a temporary system recalibration, she replied smoothly, though her jaw tightened. Our headquarters operates on a proprietary integrated grid. Redundancies are activating. As if contradicting her, the digital wall behind her glitched, presentation slides dissolving into static. A murmur swept the room. Graham Holt stepped closer, whispering, elevators are frozen. Security nodes are cycling. It says it's an internal sync fault. Fix it, she said without looking at him. They're trying. Across the floor, assistants tested biometric panels that flashed error messages in sterile blue text. Access denied. Override unavailable. The building's hum deepened into a mechanical groan. Down in maintenance, Caleb expanded the system architecture view. The fault map resembled a spreading fracture through glass, originating not from the servers, but from the synchronization cord tying primary and backup power relays together. Arrogant design, he thought again. Too centralized. The junior technician wiped sweat from his brow. Executive floors are requesting manual override. They won't get one from software, Caleb said. He zoomed further in, peeling back abstraction layers until raw relay logic appeared, lines of code mapped against physical switch arrays. Most engineers never needed to see this depth. It was buried, protected. But he understood buried systems. He picked up the maintenance radio. Operations. This is sub-basement. You need to physically access Relay Cluster B7. Static crackled before Graham's voice returned, thinner now. Security corridors are sealed. We can't reach it. Then, route through service shafts. A beat. Those are restricted. They're also your only path. Upstairs, Alara turned toward the panoramic windows overlooking the city. Sirens echoed faintly below, traffic reacting to stalled building exits. Her reflection stared back at her, composed, sharp, unyielding. Call external engineers, she ordered. We already did, Graham replied. Earliest arrival is 40 minutes. 40 minutes. The room temperature dipped as climate systems misaligned. Investors loosened ties. Someone muttered about liability. A sudden metallic slam reverberated through the building, one elevator's safety brake engaging hard. Gasps filled the executive suite. Alara's control slipped for the first time. Why is this escalating? Graham hesitated. Maintenance flagged it early. Her eyes sharpened. Maintenance? Yes, which engineer? It wasn't engineering. Down below, Caleb crouched beside a steel cabinet housing manual relay toggles, an old safeguard rarely used. He brushed dust from its surface. The cabinet was locked behind a secondary authentication layer requiring executive clearance. Of course it was. He keyed the radio again. You'll need to authorize physical override access. Silence. Upstairs, Graham relayed the request. Alara stared at him. Authorize a maintenance worker to access core relay clusters? He's the one who identified the sync fault. Her lips thinned. Our engineering team is looking at the wrong layer. Another violent jolt shook the room. One of the ceiling lights burst with a sharp pop, scattering glass onto the polished table. The investors rose to their feet. Control was no longer theoretical. It was physical, audible. Alara inhaled slowly, recalibrating pride against consequence. Who is he? She asked. Caleb Rowan, Graham replied. Maintenance technician. The name landed without recognition. Below, Caleb studied the cabinet lock, aware that every second tightened the system's spiral. He could feel heat building through the floor from overloaded conduits. The air carried a faint scent of ozone. He rested a hand briefly on the lunchbox beside him, steadying himself. Upstairs, Alara made her decision. Authorize temporary override clearance, she said. If this backfires, it already is, Graham murmured. Moments later, Caleb's tablet chimed. Executive-level authorization granted. The junior technician stared at him. They're giving you access, he nodded once. Above them, alarms blended with anxious voices. Investors were no longer murmuring, they were calculating losses. Caleb slid the cabinet door open. Inside, rows of manual switches waited, untouched for years. Power never looked here. He rolled his shoulders back, centering himself as the building groaned again, louder this time, like metal protesting its own design. Then he reached in. His fingers hovered over the first relay toggle, not touching it yet, just feeling the heat radiating from the metal panel. The switches weren't labeled in plain language. They were coded, layered abbreviations referencing subsystems buried deep within the building's architecture. Behind him, the junior technician swallowed audibly. "Are you sure about this?" "No," Caleb answered honestly. "But I'm sure about what happens if we don't." Another tremor rippled through the concrete floor. Overhead pipes rattled in protest. Somewhere in the shaft above them, an elevator cable groaned under strain. He exhaled once and flipped the first switch. The effect was immediate. The lights dimmed to half power across the maintenance corridor, plunging the space into a harsher shade of industrial gray. The tablet in his hand recalculated load distribution, rerouting excess draw away from presentation systems and toward structural stabilization. Upstairs, the executive conference room dipped into shadow. Gasps rose again. "Alara," Graham began. "I can see it," she snapped, though her voice wavered. Digital displays around the room flickered out entirely. The skyline beyond the windows reflected only the muted glow of emergency strips along the floor. Investors fumbled for their phones, some checking signals, others recording. "What's happening now?" one demanded. "Controlled reduction," Alara replied, but she no longer sounded certain. Down below, Caleb scanned the tablet's response curve. The cascade slowed, slightly, but the synchronization cores still pulsed unstable red. They built redundancy loops that mirror each other, he muttered. When one panics, the other follows. The junior technician stared at the fault diagram. "Can't we just reset the grid? If we reset without isolating the feedback loop, it'll spike harder." A loud metallic bang echoed from the ventilation shaft, followed by a brief shower of dust drifting from the ceiling. The building felt less like a structure now, and more like a living thing resisting restraint. Upstairs, security doors sealed fully across the executive corridor, locking the conference suite from the main lobby. Biometric panels blinked error codes. Graham's phone buzzed with frantic messages from department heads. "Alara," he said quietly, stepping closer. "If this continues, we'll trigger full safety lockdown. That includes data vault containment." Her eyes widened for a fraction of a second. The vault housed proprietary aerospace contracts, billions in valuation. "That cannot happen," she said. "It's already trending there." Another vibration coursed through the structure, stronger, deeper. One of the glass water pitchers on the conference table tipped and shattered. Below, Caleb flipped a second toggle, isolating climate systems from primary relay draw. The maintenance corridor air grew warmer instantly. He felt sweat gather at his collar, but didn't wipe it away. "Relay Cluster C is heating," the junior technician said. "I see it." The sync fault map pulsed again, then shifted. For the first time since the alarms began, a narrow green corridor appeared across the architecture display. A path. Temporary, fragile, but real. He studied it, tracing the logic pattern with his eyes. Upstairs, Alara paced once across the darkened room, heels sharp against marble. She caught her reflection in the blackened presentation screen and barely recognized the expression staring back. "How long?" An investor pressed. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she turned to Graham. "Put me on with maintenance." Moments later, Caleb's radio crackled to life. "This is Alara Voss." Her voice came through, controlled, clipped. "Explain to me what you're doing." He didn't look at the device when he replied. His focus stayed on the relay matrix. Isolating the feedback loop between primary and backup generators, why weren't our engineers aware of this flaw? "They designed the layers," he said calmly. "Not the failure points." A pause stretched between them. "You're saying my system is flawed?" she asked. I'm saying it's overloaded. The building shuddered again, punctuating his words. Upstairs, several investors exchanged uneasy glances. Elara lowered her voice. If this fails, it won't, he said, not arrogantly, just certain. The certainty unsettled her more than panic would have. Down below, he adjusted a third switch, but stopped midway. The green corridor on the tablet flickered. Something upstream was resisting. He leaned closer to the screen. Cluster B7 is still drawing presentation load, he said sharply. You need to shut down the live investor feed. That feed is global, she replied instantly. Cutting it would trigger vault containment if the spike continues, he interrupted. Your choice. Silence filled both ends of the line. Upstairs, Elara scanned the anxious faces around her, the men and women whose investments shaped the company's future. Pride pressed against pragmatism. Another metallic crack echoed through the building. Cut the feed, she ordered finally. Screens across the conference room went black. Down below, the green corridor widened. Caleb flipped the third toggle fully into place. The building's groan softened, just slightly. But the sync core still glowed red, and somewhere deep in the architecture, something else shifted. Something older than the presentation, load. Something embedded in the original design. He felt it before he saw it. This wasn't just overload. It was a flaw that had been waiting years for the right pressure to reveal itself. Caleb leaned closer to the relay matrix, breath steady despite the rising heat in the maintenance corridor. The sync core pulsed red again, slower now, but deeper, like a buried engine refusing to shut down. This isn't just a presentation load, he said quietly. The junior technician wiped his forehead. Then what is it? He expanded the architectural timeline, tracing backward through update logs. Layers of software patches stacked neatly across the interface, each signed off by executive engineering teams. Efficient. Impressive. Incomplete. They updated the surface, he murmured, not the backbone. Above them, the building lurched again. A sharp clang echoed through the ventilation shafts, followed by the distant thud of an elevator cabin settling hard against emergency brakes. On the executive floor, the darkness felt heavier now. Emergency lighting cast long shadows across the obsidian table. Investors stood clustered near the windows, phones pressed to their ears, murmuring into weak signals. Elara, Graham said, lowering his voice. We've cut non-essential systems. What else does he need? She hesitated only a moment before responding into the radio. What's the root issue? Caleb didn't rush his answer. He studied the relay heat map blooming across his screen like a spreading bruise. The synchronization core was designed with mirrored redundancy, he explained. Primary and backup grids trust each other too much. When one spikes, the other amplifies instead of stabilizing. You're saying our fail-safe is failing, she replied. I'm saying it was never a true fail-safe. The words settled heavily in the executive suite. One of the investors stepped forward. Is he qualified to make that assessment? Elara didn't respond immediately. Below, Caleb reached for the lunchbox and shifted it further from the heat of the open cabinet. The eagle insignia caught the flicker of emergency light. He glanced at it only briefly before returning to the screen. If we don't decouple the mirrored loop, he continued, the core will trigger vault containment within 12 minutes. 12? Graham repeated sharply. Less if load rebounds. The junior technician stared at the ticking countdown appearing in the corner of the interface. Can we decouple it manually? Yes. He didn't add that it required precision few people trained for. Upstairs, tension thickened the air. Investors were no longer whispering. They were openly calculating exposure. Elara, one said, voice edged with accusation, if proprietary contracts are compromised, they won't be, she cut in. though her gaze drifted toward the sealed vault corridor beyond the glass. Her voice returned to the radio. "What do you need?" "Full access to Relay Cluster D," Caleb replied. "Physical proximity, that's in the executive subfloor," Graham said quietly. Restricted zone, the irony hung unspoken. Alara exhaled slowly. Pride was expensive. Collapse was worse. "Authorize it," she said. Moments later, Caleb's tablet chimed again. Clearance extended. He closed the relay cabinet and grabbed the lunchbox with one hand, tucking it securely under his arm. The junior technician blinked. "You're taking that?" "Not leaving it behind." They moved quickly through the maintenance corridor, boots striking concrete as alarms shifted into a higher pitch. The air grew hotter as they approached the executive subfloor access hatch. Power never looked here, but now it was converging. Upstairs, Alara stood rigid as another tremor rattled the glass walls. Graham leaned closer. "He's heading to decluster." "Keep the investors contained," she replied. "Contained?" he echoed. "Calm," she corrected sharply. Down below, Caleb keyed the hatch override. The metal door groaned open, revealing a narrow shaft descending into the executive relay chamber, a space rarely entered, built more for design symmetry than human access. He clipped the lunchbox onto a side rung of the ladder before climbing down. The chamber air felt suffocating, thick with electrical heat and the metallic tang of ozone. Rows of high-voltage panels lined the walls, their indicator lights blinking erratically. He landed lightly on the grated floor and scanned the configuration. There, he muttered, spotting the mirrored synchronization array glowing almost white-hot. The flaw wasn't new. It had been there from installation, an elegant oversight buried beneath layers of confidence. He keyed the radio. "I'm at decluster." Above, Alara pressed the receiver closer. "How long?" 10 minutes if I'm careful," he said. 5 if I'm not." Another violent jolt shook the chamber, sending a rain of dust from the ceiling. One of the panels sparked sharply, lighting the room with a brief blue flash. The junior technician shouted from the ladder, "Voltage spike." Caleb didn't flinch. He studied the mirrored relays, two systems locked in perfect symmetry, feeding each other's instability. Poetic justice, he thought faintly. Beautiful design undone by its own reflection. He reached into the tool pouch at his belt, pulling out insulated gloves worn smooth by years of unseen repairs. "All right," he breathed. "Before he begins the manual decoupling that will decide whether this building survives, hit subscribe if you believe the people who keep systems running deserve more respect." Stories like this remind us who really holds the foundation together. He slid the gloves on, eyes steady. 5 minutes if he wasn't careful. He chose to be careful. The chamber vibrated under his boots as another surge rolled through the mirrored array. Caleb flexed his gloved fingers once, then stepped toward the synchronization core. Heat pressed against his face, dry and metallic, carrying the sharp scent of scorched insulation. Above him, the junior technician clung to the ladder. "Voltage is climbing again." "I know." He crouched in front of the array. Two relay banks faced each other like dueling mirrors, primary and backup grids feeding signals back and forth in escalating rhythm. Their indicator lights pulsed out of sync, then slammed back together in dangerous harmony. They trusted symmetry more than separation, he murmured. Upstairs, Alara stood rigid in the dim conference suite, one hand braced against the obsidian table. Graham hovered near her shoulder, phone buzzing endlessly with department updates. "He says 5 minutes," Graham whispered. "Then he has 4, she replied. A tremor rattled the glass walls again. Emergency lights flickered, then stabilized. Investors were no longer pretending calm. Two argued quietly near the sealed door, calculating exit strategies that didn't exist. Back below, Caleb removed a small, insulated driver from his pouch and began loosening the casing bolts on the first relay housing. Each turn required precision. Too fast and the torque might snap the aged threads, too slow and the heat would spike beyond safe limits. Sweat rolled down his temple, stinging his eyes. He ignored it. The mirrored banks flared brighter, as if sensing interference. System resistance increasing, the technician called. It will, Caleb replied evenly. He pulled the housing plate free, exposing the relay's internal logic board, a dense lattice of microswitches and copper pathways. Elegant, overconfident. He traced the feedback loop visually before touching anything. Years ago, in another chamber humming with far greater stakes, he'd learned the discipline of patience. Panic wasted time. Precision saved it. The array pulsed violently, sending a crackling arc across the secondary panel. Sparks showered briefly, lighting the chamber in electric blue. Upstairs, the building groaned loud enough for everyone in the conference room to hear it clearly now. What was that? An investor demanded. Manual intervention, Alara replied, though her fingers tightened against the table's edge. Below, Caleb reached into the relay core and manually disengaged the mirrored handshake connector, a thin, braided cable that forced both grids to validate each other's load in real time. The moment he detached it, the array screamed in protest, an escalating whine of strained current. Voltage spike. The technician shouted. "Hold steady," Caleb said. He rerouted the primary grid to a standalone logic gate, isolating it from backup influence. The system resisted, flashing warning indicators across the chamber walls. He ignored the warnings. They built you to be beautiful, he muttered under his breath. Not resilient. He secured the standalone gate with a firm twist, then moved to the backup relay. This was the delicate part. If he severed synchronization without stabilizing buffer flow, both grids would collapse simultaneously. Another tremor shook the ladder above. The technician's voice wavered. "We're down to 8 minutes before vault containment. I won't need 8. He removed the second housing plate and exposed the mirrored board. Heat radiated intensely now, forcing him to work quickly but not recklessly. Above, Alara's radio crackled. "What's his status?" she demanded. Graham listened to the maintenance feed, then replied, "He's isolating the grids." A sharp cracking noise reverberated through the conference suite as one of the exterior glass panels fractured slightly along its corner seam. Alara's composure faltered for half a heartbeat. Below, Caleb slid a stabilizer clamp into place, manually overriding the feedback loop's echo cycle. The whining pitch dropped suddenly, replaced by a low mechanical hum. The mirrored banks flickered, then separated. On his tablet, the sync core shifted from red to amber. He didn't relax. Careful meant complete. He recalibrated load distribution manually, feeding excess draw into dormant auxiliary conduits originally installed for expansion wings that were never built. Untapped capacity. Hidden margin. The building inhaled. Above, emergency lights brightened incrementally. The oppressive hum softened. Investors looked up as climate control returned in cautious increments. Graham exhaled audibly. Levels are stabilizing. Alara stared at the glass wall, watching the city lights reflect steadily again. Below, Caleb secured the final connector and stepped back from the array. On the tablet, the sync cord turned green. Silence filled the chamber, not absence of sound, but the steady, controlled rhythm of a building listening to itself again. The junior technician blinked down at him. "You did it." Caleb peeled off one glove slowly. "No," he said quietly. "I corrected it. Upstairs, elevator systems reset. Locked doors disengaged with soft mechanical clicks. Presentation screens flickered back to life, though no one rushed to resume them." In the executive suite, Graham lowered his phone. It's stable, he announced. Every eye turned toward Ilara. She said nothing for a long moment. Then, almost reluctantly, she reached for the radio again. Maintenance, she said, voice measured but different now. Report. In the chamber below, Caleb wiped sweat from his brow and picked up the lunchbox from the ladder rung. It's stable, he replied calmly, but your architecture needs redesign. A pause stretched between floors. And for the first time since the humiliation in the lobby, she had no immediate response. And in front of the very witnesses who had watched her threaten his job that morning, the power dynamic shifted again. This time, not through alarms or trembling glass, but through recognition. The conference suite was quiet enough to hear the soft hum of restored climate control. Investors stood still, their earlier panic replaced by sharp attention. Graham's tablet hung forgotten at his side. Ilara's gaze remained fixed on the lunchbox. The orbital resonance failure, she said slowly, 5 years ago. Our subsidiary's launch platform almost collapsed during testing. Caleb adjusted his grip on the metal handle. Yes, you were the systems engineer who decoupled the feedback loop manually. I was part of the team. Her jaw tightened. You led it. He didn't respond. The silence stretched, thick but not hostile, just undeniable. One of the investors cleared his throat. You're telling me the maintenance technician who stabilized this building also stabilized an aerospace launch platform? Caleb's expression didn't change. I stabilized the relay architecture. Same principle. Graham looked between them, confusion giving way to understanding. Why are you in maintenance? The question wasn't accusatory, just stunned. He met Graham's eyes first. Because I needed predictable hours. A flicker of something crossed Ilara's face, something less defensive now. You left aerospace engineering for predictable hours? My wife passed, he said quietly. My daughter needed consistency. There was no self-pity in the words, just fact. A weight settled over the room heavier than any system alarm. Investors shifted uncomfortably. The narrative they'd constructed in their minds about hierarchy, credentials, roles, had fractured. Ilara studied him as if recalculating every assumption she'd made that morning in the lobby. The polished executive persona she wore so effortlessly seemed to thin at the edges. You never disclosed your background, she said finally. It wasn't required for the job. That's not what I meant. He knew. But he didn't fill the silence for her. Graham spoke carefully. Engineering signed off on that mirrored redundancy model 2 years ago. It passed simulation, Ilara replied, still watching Caleb. Under projected loads, simulations don't replicate pressure, Caleb said evenly. Real systems don't fail politely. The investors exchanged glances again, this time not skeptical, but thoughtful. One of them stepped closer to the table. Miss Voss, the stability of your infrastructure is a condition of our continued investment. She nodded once without breaking eye contact with Caleb. I'm aware. The lunchbox shifted slightly in his hand as he adjusted his stance. The eagle insignia caught the overhead lights again. Ilara's eyes followed it instinctively. That insignia, she said, almost to herself. It was only issued to senior relay architects on that task force. He didn't confirm it directly. But he didn't deny it either. In the quiet that followed, the earlier humiliation in the lobby replayed invisibly in everyone's minds. The final warning, the laughter, the dismissive tone. Now those same witnesses stood in a different configuration, watching her instead of him. Poetic justice rarely announced itself loudly. It unfolded in recognition. Graham finally broke the silence. He flagged the sync fault before escalation. Engineering missed it. Ilara inhaled slowly. You said our architecture needs redesign, she said to Caleb. What would you change? The question wasn't sharp this time. It was measured. Separate the redundancy loops physically, he replied. Build isolation triggers into the primary core. And stop relying on mirrored validation under peak load. You'd need to map the entire grid, yes. Another quiet ripple moved through the investors. Elara folded her hands behind her back. That would require months of restructuring. It would prevent what almost happened today. Her gaze didn't waver. For a moment, pride flickered across her expression, then faded, replaced by something steadier. You stabilized the system in under 10 minutes, she said. He nodded once. Because I know how it thinks. The room absorbed that. He didn't say because I designed systems like it. He didn't say because I've faced worse. He didn't need to. Elara took a single step closer to him, closing the distance that had once felt insurmountable. In the lobby, she began, voice lower now, I misjudged you. The admission was subtle, but public. Investors heard it. Graham heard it. Assistants standing near the doorway heard it. Caleb didn't smile. He didn't bow his head. He simply said, You judged my schedule. The correction was gentle, precise. A faint exhale escaped her. Yes, she said. The power dynamic had inverted fully now, not through spectacle, but through clarity. Outside the conference room windows, the city skyline shimmered under steady daylight again. Inside, the building stood stable, because the man once threatened with termination had understood it better than anyone else in the room. Elara straightened. We're not finished discussing this, she said carefully. But for now, thank you. The words were simple, but they landed differently than anything she'd said that morning. The air in the conference suite shifted, not with tension now, but recalibration. Investors resumed their seats slowly, though none reopened their laptops. They were watching a different kind of presentation unfold. Elara didn't look away from him. You said you know how the system thinks, she said. Walk us through it. Graham blinked. Right now? Yes. Right now, Caleb stood still for a moment, weighing the room. The same executives who had watched him receive a final warning were now waiting for instruction. He set the lunchbox gently on the edge of the obsidian table. The scratched eagle insignia rested in plain view beneath the overhead lights. Your architecture was built for symmetry, he began evenly. Primary and backup grids mirror each other under the assumption that balance equals stability. Several investors nodded faintly, recognizing the logic. It works under moderate load, he continued. But under peak pressure, mirrored systems amplify fluctuations instead of absorbing them. They validate each other's panic. Graham leaned forward. So the more it tried to stabilize, the more unstable it became, Caleb finished. Elara folded her arms loosely. And your solution? Separate the loops. Introduce independent isolation triggers. Let one grid fail quietly without dragging the other with it. The room fell silent again, but this time the silence felt constructive. One of the investors spoke carefully. How long would such a redesign take? 3 months if phased, Caleb replied. Less if prioritized. And cost? Less than a single vault containment incident. A faint murmur of agreement moved around the table. Elara's gaze sharpened, not defensive but analytical. You're proposing structural modification to the company's flagship headquarters. I'm proposing resilience. The word lingered. Outside the glass walls, employees moved cautiously along the executive corridor, glancing inside at the unusual gathering. Power had shifted rooms. Graham cleared his throat. Engineering will need oversight. Elara didn't look at him. Yes, her eyes remained on Caleb. You're not maintenance, she said quietly. I am today, that's not what I meant. He didn't respond to that. The investors exchanged looks again. One of them, an older woman with silver hair pulled tight at the nape of her neck, leaned forward. Miss Voss, she said, if this man prevented catastrophic data containment and exposed a structural flaw your engineers overlooked, Perhaps the question isn't what his title is, it's what it should be. The statement landed heavier than any accusation. Alara's jaw tightened, but not in resistance. In calculation. Caleb rested a hand lightly on the lunchbox, grounding himself in its familiar weight. He hadn't come upstairs expecting validation. He'd come to stop a failure. Everything beyond that felt secondary. Alara finally spoke. "Graham," she said, still looking at Caleb, "what would it require to initiate a systems review under external supervision?" Graham hesitated. "Board approval. Investor confidence. You have both," she replied, gesturing subtly around the room. Several investors nodded in confirmation. The older woman added, "You'd be remiss not to." Alara inhaled slowly. Then she addressed Caleb directly. "If I asked you to oversee the redesign, would you accept?" The question carried weight, not just professional, but personal. He considered it carefully. "My priority is my daughter," he said. Predictable hours. A faint, almost imperceptible shift crossed her expression. "We can accommodate that," she replied. This would not be aerospace launch windows. It would be structural oversight. Graham's eyes widened slightly. "You're offering him. I'm offering expertise the position requires," she said. The earlier humiliation echoed faintly in the space, but now it felt distant, almost unreal. Before we move further, subscribe and turn on the bell if you believe real expertise deserves recognition, even when it wears work boots. Stories like this remind us who truly holds things together. The investors didn't hear that line, but the tension in the room mirrored it. Caleb studied her for a moment. "You'd need transparency," he said, "with engineering, with maintenance, no silos." Alara nodded once, agreed, and structural autonomy, he added. Graham let out a quiet breath. "That's substantial. It's necessary," Caleb replied calmly. Silence followed again, but this time it felt decisive. Alara extended her hand, not as a superior, as a professional. "Oversee the redesign," she said, "on your terms." For a fraction of a second, the lobby humiliation and the relay chamber heat overlapped in memory. Then he reached out and shook her hand. The handshake wasn't triumphant. It wasn't theatrical. It was balanced. And in front of the very witnesses who had seen him nearly fired, the maintenance technician became the architect of the company's resilience. The handshake lingered a second longer than expected, not for spectacle, but for acknowledgement. When their hands separated, the air in the conference suite felt steadier than the building's restored hum. Graham was the first to move. "I'll notify engineering and legal," he said carefully. "We'll need to formalize oversight parameters." "Do that," Alara replied. Her voice had regained its composure, but something fundamental had shifted. The sharp edges were still there, just redirected. Caleb picked up the lunchbox from the obsidian table. The eagle insignia caught the light again, but this time no one mistook it for decoration. One of the investors leaned back in her chair. "Mr. Rowan," she said, testing the name thoughtfully, "you mentioned untapped auxiliary conduits." "Yes. Why weren't they integrated initially?" He met her gaze. They were installed for expansion wings that never materialized. Budget reallocation, I assume. A subtle glance passed between Graham and Alara. "We prioritized visible growth," Graham admitted quietly. "And neglected hidden capacity," Caleb replied. The words weren't accusatory, just factual. Poetic justice rarely needed sarcasm. It revealed imbalance with clarity. Alara folded her hands on the table. "You'll have full access to architectural documentation starting tomorrow. Today would be better," he said calmly. A faint ripple of restrained amusement moved around the table. The same tone she had used on him hours earlier now returned, measured, direct, but without condescension. Today, she agreed. Outside the glass walls, employees had begun resuming movement. Word of the near lockdown had already spread, so had whispers of who stabilized it. The executive doors remained open now, no longer sealed by emergency protocol. Graham cleared his throat. There's one more issue. Alara glanced at him. The lobby incident this morning, he said carefully. Silence fell again, heavier than before. Investors shifted in their seats, suddenly aware that the earlier public reprimand had been just as visible as the crisis. Alara didn't look away from Caleb this time. I was unaware of your circumstances, she said evenly. My circumstances weren't the system's problem, he replied. That's not what I meant, she said, a hint of frustration surfacing, not defensive but personal. He studied her for a moment. You evaluated me on punctuality, he said, not performance. Her jaw tightened slightly. And you were correct about one thing, he added. Patterns matter. Graham glanced between them, unsure whether to intervene. Alara's voice lowered. Are you saying my leadership lacks pattern recognition? I'm saying you look at metrics before mechanisms. The room absorbed that quietly. Investors leaned in, not to interrupt, but to witness. She didn't bristle. Instead, she asked, And you? I look at mechanisms first, he replied. The contrast hung between them, clean, undeniable. One of the investors finally spoke. Leadership that integrates both tends to survive longer. A faint nod passed around the table. Alara exhaled slowly. This morning, she said, I issued a final warning. The words felt different now, echoing in a room that had seen the full reversal. Yes, he answered simply. She held his gaze. That warning is rescinded. The statement was not loud. It didn't need to be. Graham straightened subtly. Assistants near the doorway exchanged quick glances. And effective immediately, she continued, your position transitions from maintenance technician to structural systems oversight lead. Compensation will reflect that. A murmur rippled through the investors, not surprise, but approval. Caleb didn't smile broadly, didn't celebrate. He just nodded once. My hours remain predictable, he said. They will, she replied. And maintenance staff are included in structural review meetings. A flicker of something, respect perhaps, crossed her expression. They will be. The negotiation was balanced now, no longer vertical. Outside, the skyline gleamed under steady afternoon light. Inside, the building hummed evenly, no longer straining against itself. Poetic justice wasn't in applause. It was in correction. Graham extended his hand this time. Congratulations, he said quietly. Caleb shook it briefly. As he turned toward the open doorway, Alara's voice stopped him. One more thing. He paused. She stepped closer, not as an authority figure, but as someone recalibrating her own structure. I misjudged more than your schedule, she said. The admission was simple, direct. Investors heard it. Staff heard it. He inclined his head slightly. Systems fail under pressure, he replied. So do people. A faint breath escaped her, almost a laugh, almost a release. And both can be redesigned, she said. Yes, he answered. Then he stepped out of the conference suite, not back into the shadows of maintenance, but into a corridor that felt subtly different now. Power still lived on the executive floor. But it no longer looked only at itself. Caleb stepped into the corridor, the murmur of executives resuming business trailing behind him like an aftershock. Assistants who had once glanced past him now nodded as he walked by. Not exaggerated, not performative, just different. The marble floor reflected his boots again, but the reflection didn't feel misplaced. Graham caught up with him halfway down the hall. We'll need to schedule a full architectural audit, he said, already shifting into operational mode. Engineering's going to push back. They should, Caleb replied. Graham blinked. You want resistance? I want questions, he said calmly. If they don't argue, they don't understand it yet. The COO studied him for a moment, then nodded slowly. You're not what I expected. I get that a lot. They reached the elevator bank, the same private lifts that had stood as silent witnesses to the morning's reprimand. Now they were operational again, lights steady, doors sliding open with mechanical precision. Graham hesitated before pressing the button. You're heading back down? Yes. You don't want to stay? Debrief with the board? Caleb glanced at the lunchbox still in his hand. I've got a daughter who thinks I almost got fired today. Graham's expression softened. Right. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime. Before stepping inside, Caleb turned slightly. Send me the architectural schematics, he said. Full depth. Not summary layers, you'll have them within the hour. He nodded once and stepped into the lift. As the doors closed, the executive floor disappeared behind brushed steel panels. The descent felt different this time, not retreat, but repositioning. In the conference suite, Alara remained standing near the window long after the investors resumed discussion. You handled that well, the silver-haired investor said quietly. I nearly mishandled it entirely, Alara replied. But you corrected. She didn't answer immediately. Through the glass, she could see employees moving again with renewed purpose. Somewhere below, the systems she had once trusted blindly were now under scrutiny, not by consultants or simulations, but by someone who had touched their core. Leadership isn't about avoiding error, the investor added. It's about what you do when it surfaces. Alara's reflection stared back at her again. Down in the service elevator, Caleb exhaled slowly as the floors ticked downward. The adrenaline that had carried him through the relay chamber was fading now, replaced by a steady fatigue. He leaned his head briefly against the cool steel wall. Final warning. The phrase felt distant now. Not erased, but contextualized. When the elevator doors opened onto the maintenance level, the junior technician straightened immediately. Is it true? He asked. They offered you oversight? Yes. The technician let out a low whistle. From almost fired, too. Don't, Caleb said gently. It's not about that. The younger man frowned. Then what is it about? Fixing what's fragile, he set the lunchbox back on the steel workbench and reopened the tablet. The building's core glowed green, stable but still carrying the echo of stress. Maintenance staff gathered gradually, drawn by word of what had happened upstairs. They didn't crowd him. They just watched. One of them, an older electrician with calloused hands, spoke up. Heard you told the CEO her system was flawed. Caleb gave a faint shrug. It was. A quiet chuckle rippled through the room, not mocking but appreciative. You're still coming down here? The electrician asked. I'm not leaving, he replied. Oversight doesn't mean distance. The statement mattered more than the title. Above them, Alara entered the engineering wing for the first time that afternoon. Her steps were sharp, purposeful. Engineers looked up from terminals as she approached. We're initiating a full architectural review, she announced. Effective immediately, murmurs rose. With external oversight, she continued. One engineer frowned. External? She held his gaze evenly. Internal experience. Confusion flickered, then dawning recognition. The maintenance tech? Someone whispered. Yes, she said simply. Resistance sparked immediately. He's not on the design team. He stabilized your design in under 10 minutes, she cut in. Silence followed. Prepare your documentation, she said. We start tomorrow. Back in maintenance, Caleb finished logging the relay adjustments and closed the cabinet hatch securely. The building felt calm again, not complacent, just aware. He checked the time on his watch. School pickup was in 40 minutes. He wiped his hands clean, slipped the lunchbox under his arm, and headed toward the service elevator once more. As the doors closed around him, the hum of the headquarters sounded different, less like a machine running on assumption, more like a structure learning from stress. Poetic justice didn't come with applause. It came with redesign. And this time, the men who had once been warned about punctuality would shape the very architecture that defined the company's future. The service elevator hummed upward again, though only one floor this time, back to the lobby level. Caleb stepped out into the same polished expanse where the morning's humiliation had unfolded. The marble gleamed. The citrus polish still lingered faintly in the air. But the atmosphere had changed. Receptionists who had avoided eye contact earlier now offered small, genuine nods. A pair of analysts near the glass doors straightened subtly as he passed. No laughter this time. No whispers disguised as coughs, just acknowledgement. He crossed the lobby slowly, boots striking marble in steady rhythm. The private elevators stood to his right, silent and composed. The massive digital display behind the reception desk had resumed cycling through company milestones, launch statistics, contract expansions, innovation awards. It would need updating soon, he thought. Behind him, the executive elevator chimed. Elara stepped out. Conversations in the lobby softened instantly. She walked forward without hesitation, heels precise against stone. Graham followed a few paces behind, carrying a folder thick with preliminary audit notes. Caleb stopped instinctively. For a moment they stood facing each other in the exact place where she had issued his final warning. The symmetry wasn't lost on anyone watching. Elara's posture remained straight, controlled, but her expression held none of the sharp dismissal from earlier. "Mr. Rowan," she began. He waited. "I've informed the board of your new role," she said. "It's unanimous." Graham gave a small, confirming nod. A murmur drifted through the lobby staff. Caleb adjusted the lunchbox in his hand. "Then we start tomorrow." "We start tonight," she corrected gently. "Engineering has already begun compiling full documentation." He inclined his head slightly. "Good." A pause lingered between them, not tense, but deliberate. Elara glanced around the lobby briefly, then back at him. "This morning," she said, voice carrying just enough to be heard by those nearby, "I addressed you publicly." He didn't interrupt. It's appropriate that I correct that publicly. The words settled across the marble floor like a second foundation being laid. Graham shifted his weight subtly. Staff near the reception desk leaned in almost imperceptibly. Elara continued. "You identified a critical structural flaw before escalation. You prevented vault containment and investor withdrawal. And you did so under extraordinary pressure. The lobby was completely silent now. I was wrong to reduce your value to a timestamp," she said. There was no sarcasm in her tone, no corporate polish disguising it, just clarity. Caleb held her gaze evenly. The system was under pressure. "Yes," she replied, "and so was I." A faint flicker of something, mutual understanding, passed between them. She extended her hand again, not as spectacle, as acknowledgement. "Thank you," she said simply. He shook her hand once. Applause didn't erupt, no one cheered, but something far more enduring settled into the space. Respect. When their hands parted, Elara stepped slightly aside, not blocking the path to the exit. It was subtle, but visible. Caleb nodded once and turned toward the glass doors. As he walked, staff moved instinctively, not to avoid him, but to clear the way. A security guard who had once checked his badge without a glance now offered a firm nod of recognition. Outside, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the city sidewalk. The building behind him stood tall and gleaming, unaware of how close it had come to betraying itself. He paused just beyond the doors and glanced back once. Through the glass, he could see Alara still standing in the lobby, watching the flow of employees with a different awareness than before. Power never looked at maintenance corridors until it needed them. His phone buzzed in his pocket. A message from Mila's school, pickup line moving quickly today. He smiled faintly and headed toward his truck. Inside the building, Graham approached Alara quietly. "You handled that well," he said. "I corrected a miscalculation," she replied. He glanced toward the maintenance corridor entrance. "He's not what we expected." "No," she said thoughtfully. "He's what we overlooked." Graham hesitated. "Engineering's uneasy." "They should be," she replied. "Resilience is uncomfortable." Her gaze drifted upward toward the executive floors, then downward toward the service levels below. "Architecture is only as strong as the humility behind it," she added quietly. In the parking lot, Caleb opened the truck door and set the lunchbox carefully on the passenger seat. The scratched eagle insignia caught the fading sunlight. He ran a thumb over it briefly before starting the engine. The building behind him hummed steadily. Corrected, not perfect. Tomorrow would bring schematics, meetings, resistance, redesign. Tonight would bring homework, dinner, and a child who just wanted her father on time. He pulled out of the lot calmly. For the first time that day, no one questioned whether he belonged. The truck rolled steadily through late afternoon traffic, city lights softening into gold against the windshield. Caleb's hands rested calmly on the steering wheel, grease still faint beneath his nails despite the quick wash in the maintenance sink. The headquarters building shrank in the rearview mirror. Corrected. Not perfect. Not invincible. Just aware. His phone buzzed again in the cup holder. A voice message this time. "Dad, are you close?" Mila's small voice carried through the speaker, hopeful but cautious. Mrs. Alvarez said it's almost pickup time. He smiled, pressing the call button through the dashboard. "I'm 5 minutes out," he said. Right on time, a pause on the other end. "You didn't get fired?" The question was soft, careful. He exhaled slowly. "No," he said. "I didn't." Another pause, longer this time, then a quiet, relieved giggle. "I told Emma you wouldn't," she said proudly. "Because you fix things," the word settled into him more firmly than the CEO's handshake ever could. "I do," he replied gently. "I fix things." The pickup line curved around the elementary school parking lot, engines idling in patient rows. He eased into place, glancing at the clock on the dashboard. 3 minutes early. When the school doors opened, children spilled out in waves of backpacks and laughter. Mila spotted the truck quickly, her ponytail bouncing as she ran toward it. He stepped out before she reached him. She collided into his legs with full force, wrapping her arms around his waist. "You're not late," she announced triumphantly. "I said I wouldn't be." She pulled back slightly, eyes scanning his face. "Did your boss yell?" He considered that. "She talked," he said, "and then we listened." Mila nodded as if that made perfect sense. Her gaze dropped to the lunchbox resting on the passenger seat. "You brought it back?" "Of course." She climbed into the truck, fastening her seatbelt carefully. "Did anyone see the eagle?" "Yes," he said quietly. "They did." "Did they know what it means?" "They do now." She beamed. As he pulled away from the school, the city seemed steadier somehow, not because buildings didn't fail or because leaders didn't misjudge, but because correction had taken place in daylight. Back at headquarters, engineering teams were already gathered around structural schematics projected across wide digital screens. Discussions were sharper, less defensive. Alara stood at the head of the room, listening more than speaking. "Separate the redundancy loops," one engineer muttered, tracing revised diagrams. "Introduce independent isolation triggers." "Yes," she said calmly. "Resilience over symmetry." Graham glanced at her quietly. "Tomorrow," she added, "he'll walk us through full structural recalibration." Some of the engineers shifted uneasily. "He's maintenance," one said under his breath. Alara's gaze sharpened slightly. "He's oversight," she corrected. The room fell silent. Outside, dusk settled against the glass fade of the building. The lights inside glowed steadily, no flicker, no strain. Architecture was learning humility. In the truck, Mila kicked her legs lightly against the seat. "Dad?" "Yeah? Are you still fixing the big building tomorrow?" "Yes. Don't let it break again," she said seriously. He smiled faintly. "I won't let it break the same way." She seemed satisfied with that answer. At a red light, he glanced at her reflection in the rearview mirror. Small, hopeful, certain in ways adults often forgot how to be. The eagle insignia on the lunchbox caught the fading sunlight again. It had once symbolized elite engineering under immense pressure. Now, it symbolized something quieter. A father who kept showing up. Back at headquarters, Alara stood alone in the lobby for a moment before leaving for the evening. The marble floors reflected her silhouette as they had that morning. Only now, she paused before stepping into the private elevator. Her eyes drifted toward the service corridor entrance. Power never looked there. It would now. The elevator doors closed softly behind her. The building hummed, a steady corrected rhythm echoing through its steel and glass bones. Not flawless, but redesigned. If this story moved you, ask me for the next story title and I'll bring it to life. Subscribe, and don't miss our next story. She mocked a single dad at the parent meeting, then the superintendent called him sir. Trust me, you'll feel it. And tell me in the comments, what injustice should we tackle next?